the last thing we were going to discuss is the problem of good and evil and Christianity and the problem of good and evil. There are two questions. One, how to respond to, people who bring it up, since it's a major concern for many non-Christians. And then the second issue is, personally, how do we respond to it in, our own lives, given our own faith? Because the problem is, that it causes many people to lose faith.
But I know, I'm thinking in one respect that's sad, knowing that it should have them have a stronger faith, because when you realize how weak and terrible humans are, I mean, we are so fallible and cause, we sin, we're sinners, we sin so much. We were given a choice, and the temptations are too much out there, to do evil. And so that just shows the weakness of man and the importance of a stronger faith and trying to do better.
Although, but the problem, is that, so it's indeed true that, Jesus talked about the need to separate the sheep and the goats at the end of time, and the weeds and the wheat being mixed together and only being able to separate them at the end of time. So on the one hand, that's true, but on the other hand, in many ways, especially the unchurched people who aren't Christians at least in our predominantly Christian society, expect that Christians in some form should imitate Christ. And so then the problem is, when you see behavior that by secular standards is sinful being widely practiced by Christians who, then are self-righteous and, pronounce themselves saved or, religious or faith-filled or whatever, then what do you think?
Well, yeah, that's the problem. A lot of terrible people call themselves Christians, but that shouldn't affect the love of God and the faith of those who do believe him, who want to believe in him, based on the miserable things that happen because of other people, and what they choose to do. I mean, it should make others just feel that much stronger.
Well,
but I understand what you're saying, and I don't know how to say what I'm thinking.
I mean, there are a number of groups of, people. The first are the unchurched. So I mean, a basic problem is that God has chosen, to work through people, and except in the case of his son, through imperfect people. So, we're all imperfect. The saints were imperfect. Everybody's imperfect.
So Christ and his mother.
Right.
Right. And so,
She was the only human. Only.
so we're all imperfect. So for people who have, so that requires that we who are imperfect lead people who don't know God to faith. And so if we look at many people who don't know God, have rejected God, they on the one hand recognize the enormous contributions of people of faith, and the amazing things that some of them did. If you ask even militant atheists to name say 5 Christians who they admire. When I was an atheist, if you asked me to name 5 Christians who I admired, I certainly would have done it. Christ himself, Pope John the 23rd, Martin Luther King, St. Francis, and John Brown.
Who's John Brown?
John Brown's Rebellion. He seized the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, along with as a protest against slavery. One of the people who fought in the uprising with him and died was Langston Hughes's grandfather.
Oh.
So on the one hand, you can name great Christians and recognize their contribution. On the other hand, you kind of survey the state of Christianity and it's bleak.
Yeah. On the other hand, too, though, there are, if I was asked to something like that, to name, some great Christians who I thought were really great, or other great people in other areas. The thing is there's a lot more out there than I can think of that I never even knew about. I mean, when you think about it, the true Christians, some of the best are quiet and humble, and no one ever knows about them.
Right.
But through their prayers and good deeds, praying for the world and trying to do right, those kind of Christians are the ones that have God coming back and forgiving and giving us another chance all the time.
Mm-hmm.
As you read through the Bible,
Right.
and it's over and over. He takes them back and forgives them, and then they stop loving him and they worship others after a while, and then they get punished, but he takes them back. And so the thing is he's his unfathomable forgiveness is what keeps us going. And there's not a clear answer for people, I think, who say, well, look at all the terrible things that Christians do. Well, yeah, there are a lot of terrible things all people, all men do, all humans. But to try to compartmentalize it into a box, when God doesn't do that, he forgives, he's all forgiving, and always going to take everybody back. And so I think the focus should be more on just loving God and trying to follow his, the ways of Christ, and stick to that, and people not be so concerned about seeing what others have done,
But the problem is,
except to pray for them.
that these are, that the audience is people who aren't religious and don't believe in God, or are
Yeah.
at best lukewarm. So, God's forgiveness is, not particularly, important or, even conceivable to them.
Yeah. Well,
But it is,
Yeah,
and there are a lot of, sort of, huge number of dimensions to this. I mean, for myself, I was raised in a devout Catholic family. My family has, a long tradition of service to God. My father was a very holy man, but my image of a Christian was, I hate to say this, my sister. So she would go to mass and then go to see the fortune teller right afterwards. She, was always very concerned about, what she was getting. She felt that whenever anybody had something, they got it at her expense. So everybody in the world in some form owed her. She once
There's
called
one in
me,
every family, Ron.
yeah, she
There
once
is.
called me up. I was in graduate school, right? I was, so I didn't get a fellowship to graduate school, so I, had to pay myself. And so I was going to graduate school full-time, working one full-time job and one part-time job, so I could support myself through graduate school. And so out of the blue, like we really didn't have a relationship, she calls me up and says, "Hey, Ron, I saw a house I'd like to buy. Can I borrow $40,000? At that point in my life, $4 would have
Yeah.
been a severe stretch.
Wow.
40 would have been impossible. 400 is inconceivable. And this is $40,000. Where am I supposed to get, how,
Yeah.
this is insane, but this was just who she was. And, and she presented to the world the image of a devout Christian. So she was, my model of exactly, when I became an atheist, she was my model of exactly what a Christian really is.
Yeah.
And, and so, I think we see a lot of that.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I think most people, unfortunately, yeah, they see what other people are doing and seeing how sick it is, and they don't want to have any part of it. But that's it. They've got to be able to separate what they're seeing as happening as exactly what does happen with, so many of us. And to
It's
realize
really a
the importance
non-example.
or what?
It's not an example of a good Christian. It's a
Yeah.
non-example.
Yeah, exactly. It's what we really are. And we need to focus on the exact opposite. A lot of people, we know there's a lot of people who like to call themselves Christians, but they don't have any idea what it means. They don't live a life anywhere close to that. You know, they may rule a country and think they can go out and stand in front of a statue and hold up a Bible and have people think they're a Christian, you know, and it's just, that's what's sick is actually, I think so many people want to be able to have people think they're Christians. Maybe in their own weak mind, they believe that they can be that. And yet they're such a failure, you know, at anything close to it. And then
And then
other
there are
people
people
pay
who claim that-
attention to them.
Right. And then there are people who say, well, I'm not Catholic anymore, but you look at their behaviors and they're very Catholic. So it's going to be a good discussion next week. I already have a few things to.
Okay, that's
Oh, look
good.
at that. Look how long we've talked about it tonight.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get going on it.
Okay, so then that will be our discussion. And then next week should be, I guess, our last class in that case.
Oh,
Boy,
Unless we, decide to continue the discussion for 2 classes, which
well, that
would be
could happen.
fine. But we're nearing the end.
Okay.
yeah.
We had started talking about Christianity and evil and the basic contention of very many non-Christians or non-church people that Christianity often is evil, promotes evil, encourages evil. So, but there's also a second dimension of that. There's also our own separated brethren who participate and believe in evil. And so there's a question of how to apologetically engage non-Christians. There's also a question of what to do, if anything, about Christians in our midst or Christians who we know who embrace evil.
How do they embrace it?
Rejecting science, the anti-vax movement, supporting climate change, supporting genocide, supporting racism. I mean, we can, supporting the separation of families. We can go on and on with, a long list. Believing in QAnon. There's a long list of things that Christians, and in many cases, predominantly Christians, believe in that are fundamentally, evil. So, I mean, this is in both ways, this is a difficult, question. How do you respond? We can always respond that, Jesus says that, the wheat and the tares will only be separated at the end time. And, the sheep and the goats will only be separated at the end time. And the goats are clearly believers and the weeds are members of the church. But that hardly addresses the issue when there seem to be too many goats and there seem to be not very much wheat and a lot of weeds.
But I know he also said if somebody slaps you on one cheek, you give them the other. Or if they need your coat, or if they want your coat, give them your cloak as well, or something like that. So, I mean, I think what he was saying was basically you treat them with love and compassion and treat them the same way you would want to be treated yourself.
Treat with love and compassion, but but the problem is that in some ways there's, sort of a fine line between love and compassion and, a sort of moral viewpoint that everything goes, that everything is acceptable. So that's
You're-
a hard,
Yeah,
so that's a hard thing.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's
um,
not easy to do, that's for sure.
I guess one issue is, why is there so much evil within Christianity?
Maybe things are twisted in a way that sounds logical.
So, I mean, I think maybe it would be helpful to look at, sort of the individual areas that sort of stand out. So, for example, the white, um, particularly the white evangelical church, is profoundly racist.
Hmm. Yeah,
Most,
I don't understand that at all. I really don't.
most, most Black, not most, a substantial proportion of Black Americans are Protestant. And yet, the Black Protestant churches are very, very distinct from the white Protestant churches, and the Black evangelical churches, which form a substantial part of the white Protestant churches, are very, very distinct from white evangelical churches. And they also share very little in theology, and often share very little in Bible interpretation. Black churches tend to be less literalistic. They tend not to be conservative. They tend to have a very different view of who God is, that in many ways I think is not shared by white evangelical churches. There are two really good statistical sources for sort of the study of religion, Christianity, and society. There's a group called the Barna Group.
Barna?
Yeah. The person who founded it is George Barna, who is an evangelical Christian.
How do you spell that?
Barna. And the second is the Pew Research Center, which generally studies trends in society that include religion as well as a lot of other things. So it's not necessarily, purely focused on Christianity, but it does have a lot of good research. In terms of racism, the Barna Group asked whether racism is a problem of the past. And generally, 59% of Black Americans disagreed strongly. 39% of white Americans disagreed strongly. So we see that there's a significant divide there. But
I thought a lot of that type of thing though is more geared towards poverty. I mean, they get treated differently. They don't get the same kind of pay. They don't get, you know what I mean? So I can understand. I can understand why they build up these walls against the white if they're being treated differently.
But the problem, I don't think is that they're building up the walls. I think it's that predominantly white America builds up the walls.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But then the problem is,
They're not getting paid the same as everybody else, and they're not.
the problem, racism, with the view that racism is a problem of the past. First of all,
They may not even be educated, right?
what,
They're probably not educated the same way either.
who,
The black or the
yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and they can't because they're trying to work, jobs that are nobody else wants to work and just to help support the rest.
right, but so the underlying problem then is that racism is very much a problem of the present. It's not a problem of the past.
Mm.
So 87% of evangelicals say it's a problem of the past.
Mm.
And, so we've seen, today the whole, currently there's that whole attack on critical race theory, which is, profoundly racist.
Mhm.
It assumes that everything is okay, that there's no need to study the racism of the past because it hasn't carried over into the present. And, in Florida, it's reached the absurd point that what is taught in high schools and universities is now under state control, which is an unprecedented attack on academic freedom. That's just, staggering, a staggering reinterpretation of history.
Mm.
And one of the questions asked was also whether groups support Black Lives Matter and how do they respond to Black Lives Matter. So for those who didn't support Black Lives Matter, the most common response is that all lives matter.
Well, that's true. All
Mhm.
lives do matter.
Well,
All
no,
lives, no
but in
matter
the
who they are.
but in the context, it's a racist statement, though.
Not really.
Oh, yeah. So remove it from the context of race and change it to something else. So let's say you see your best friend run over by some clown who's texting and you're outraged, and the guy gets reckless driving when he's committed manslaughter, and you're outraged, and so you go to your legislator or whatever, or you try to start a movement saying that the lives of victims of drivers who are texting matter, right?
Mhm.
And if so, you go to your legislator and their response is, well, all lives matter. What are they saying?
Well, so if they say all lives matter, then say, okay, then help us out here.
But the point is that all lives matter is a non-response. It's the lives of texting victims don't matter. I'm not going to do
Well,
anything.
sure they do. All lives matter.
Yeah,
But that statement's a dismissal of the whole point
right.
too.
The statement is a dismissal.
Oh,
The context is there's racism, Blacks are being murdered, and Black Lives Matter. And we live in a society in which Black lives don't matter, and a society in which the lives of people of color don't matter. So when you say all lives matter, that just dismisses the whole thing.
Well, just like this whole thing that's going on now in the media about that 22-year-old woman who disappeared, then, you look at, okay, well, how many Indigenous women have disappeared in the Yakima Valley and
And
other
that's
Indian nations.
terrible.
And
Yeah.
how many Black people have disappeared. It was on national news the other night. Joy Reid mispronounced Tulalip, but you know, there's somebody up in the Everett area who disappeared. Have we heard about it? You know, yet you get this sensationalized story about this one woman. And you know, it's tragic, not to take
Yeah.
that away, but
Yeah.
what else is going on that's ignored?
There's a lot of things that are ignored and you
Yeah.
don't hear about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she happens to have been blonde and, you know,
Yeah.
sort of cute, which makes it a good story,
It's appeal. Yeah.
but who cares about others?
Mm. No, when I say all lives matter, I mean everybody.
Yeah.
It does matter.
Right.
Everybody matters. So we should include everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, but you know,
That's what I think of when I say that.
yeah, but in the problem is that in the context, it has the
Yeah.
opposite meaning,
Yeah.
that your life doesn't matter. So how do we respond to non-Christians who say that Christianity is racist?
Well, whenever you make a blanket statement like that, that's asking for trouble. I don't know. All the Christians I know aren't racist. That's what I'd say. I don't know.
That's one response,
Yeah.
although, you know, I mean, in some ways, the problem can't be dismissed because we clearly can see that parts of the church certainly are racist.
I mean, we have our own troubles in the Catholic Church, I know. Obviously, we're all sinners. All of us are
Obviously.
sinners, you know.
Right. I mean, we're all sinners, but in many ways,
Nobody's perfect, that's for sure.
but in many ways, actually, if we look at climate change, we see
All these people that believe in it and people that think that it's just a big hoax.
right. But the problem, say, looking at climate change, the problem is that the less unchurched you are, the more you believe that climate change is real. And the more churched you are, the more you believe it's not real or is not caused by human activity.
Really?
Yeah,
Really? I
Yeah.
think the opposite.
no.
Well,
So-
Pope Francis knows better.
What?
Pope Francis knows better.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, it's not true, but, you know, even within the Catholic Church, there's been, you know, quite a bit of opposition to Laudato Si. And you know,
Really?
if you look at Patriarch Bartholomew, who has been an environmental activist for a long time, like do a search for Patriarch Bartholomew and heresy, and I'm sure you're going to find, you know, tons of stuff. Overall, about half of the US adult population believes that global warming is real and is caused by human activity.
Mhm.
56% of Black Protestants believe that, which is more than, you know, the national average. 46% of white Catholics and 45% of Catholics overall believe it, which is less than the national average. 42% of people who attend church weekly believe that global warming, climate change is caused by human activity. 53% of people who only attend church every now and then believe it. And 64% of people who don't attend church believe it. So we see, the more churched you are, the more likely you are to believe in that global warming, climate change, either is not real or is not caused by human activity. And the problem there, if we look at racism, and they're exempt the Black church or churches, Christian churches that are predominantly composed of people of color, we see the same sort of basic relationships, that the unchurched tend to be less racist than the church.
Does it have to do with demographics? I mean, within the churches, are there more older people who attend? And
It
haven't,
is related to
Yeah.
partly demographics as well. It is
Yeah.
true that the older, the more,
the less they believe?
the more
Yeah.
racist, but also
And the
the
less-
more white, the more racist.
Yeah.
Um,
And the
So,
less educated on that too, on
right,
things like
and
global warming.
education is a
Yeah.
factor. But so the problem in many areas is that, Christianity, which should be progressive, which should stand against racism, should support the preservation of our common home. And
Yep.
if the earth goes, we're all dead.
Mhm.
Right? So, and yet we find in many ways secular society being much more progressive and taking a much more progressive position on all of those issues. And, when that happens, the conclusion that the church is evil becomes very difficult to refute.
Yeah.
And in fact, that is what, we see that, over and over again. QAnon really is, in many ways, a Christian phenomenon. 26% of evangelical Christians believe some or all of QAnon is true. And I saw one study that showed that 16% of Catholics believe that some or all of QAnon is true. That number should be 0%.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't know what QAnon stands for, or what their beliefs are.
It's a series of conspiracy theories, and particularly, the most part of it is the election was stolen, elections are fraudulent, but also that the Democrats are running prostitution rings and white slavery rings and whatever from pizza parlors, which is absurd, and yet a lot of people believe it. And it is in many ways a Christian movement. So the
Well, any kind of prostitution ring is wrong. And I know they do have them sometimes in those massage places, right?
yeah, but these are Democrats and pizza parlors.
No,
We're not
that
we're
doesn't
not
make
talking
sense.
we're
Yeah,
not talking about real prostitution rings
yeah,
or
yeah,
real white slavery rings, or
yeah,
we're talking about make believe.
yeah.
So similarly, the pandemic, much of the resistance to the pandemic has come from Christians.
But that's for a different reason,
What is the reason?
because they're using stem cells from aborted babies to to test or to, yeah, to do their testing on. So that's why there's a promotion of aborted babies, you know, to, oh, you don't need this baby, you know, well, they don't even call it a baby, they just call it some cells. You know, and they still do, and they don't show that, they don't do the what do you call it? The sonogram or whatever it's called, that shows that there's a human being in there. There's a heart that's beating.
But the cells were from cell lines taken a long time ago.
Yeah,
They're not currently
but every
aborted,
life is important. But anyway,
but
yeah,
these
yeah.
were lives that were lost a long time ago.
right. I mean,
But
there are
also-
stillborns
but
too, so
also
why
that's
can't they
not-
use those, you
But
know?
also that's only a part of the critique.
Yeah.
Mask wearing is an infringement on my rights.
Well, that's ridiculous. That's just ridiculous.
But the problem is that whether it's ridiculous or not, many
We're-
Christians believe it, and Christians are in the forefront of people
Yeah.
who believe it. Much of the resistance to the vaccine movement has nothing to do with abortion among Christians. It has something to do with, I mean, listen to Cardinal Burke. They're injecting things in you that allow them to
Oh, well,
trap
that,
you.
yeah. You see, yeah. that's
And,
ridiculous.
you know, I mean, this guy is a cardinal.
Yeah.
So, um, you know, I don't know, this, for me, this is a really hard issue. You know, when I was an atheist, if you had asked me, what are the, you know, how would you describe a Christian? I would have, depending on, you know, how charitable I was for the day, I would have had 3 adjectives: evil, immoral, or hypocritical.
Mm.
So a good
Yeah,
summary.
and
But then
that's
I
true in
became a Christian.
everybody though.
Then I became a Christian and discovered that it's even worse. And you know, that's not to say, you know, even when I would have said evil, immoral, and whatever,
I don't like putting
recognize-
Christians in a
Uh,
box like that.
I
Yeah,
recognize that there are very many good Christians.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, since I've become, when I was evangelical, I certainly, you know, didn't see a whole lot. Certainly there were some. There are a huge number more, you know, now that I've become Catholic.
Mm.
But nevertheless, the problem is that there are far too many Christians who willingly embrace evil. And the problem is that evil is always justified in the name of God. You know, so say, for example, you
I
know,
mean, he doesn't want us to be like that.
so for example, in the election, you know, if we look at the US Conference of Catholic Bishops guidelines, each Catholic is called to examine the issues and to vote according to their conscience as the Holy Spirit tells them. So that means, you know, that there's room for disagreement. You know, so
Well, everybody should vote with their conscience.
yeah, but that's
Yeah.
not exactly what's going on. So that means that, you know, we look at each candidate and their issues and we sort of weigh them and decide. So that means, you know, that if you decide to vote for Biden, that's legitimate. If you decide to vote for Trump because he's the best candidate, that's legitimate. But it's based on an evaluation of issues. Now, the problem is that when we throw in God, Trump is God's candidate.
Oh, that's what he said anyway.
Oh, that's what, you know, that's what many Catholics said. That's what many white evangelicals said. That's a huge number of Christians said that. And
People
Many-
do use people use Christianity to make their points across. And whether they're good or they're bad, they think that they can, if they throw it in there, that they're good.
Right.
You're
And
on the
that's
good side. Yeah.
right. And that's
But that's wrong. Yeah.
that's not only wrong, that's evil.
Mm.
First of all, it's blasphemous. It's a misuse of the divine name.
Yeah.
Blasphemy is the last time the last time I checked, kind of a big sin.
Sure it is. Of course.
But the other thing is, if it's God's will, what do you say? I mean,
God doesn't
I-
get involved in politics.
I disagree. I mean, you can't exactly say I disagree that it's God's will, because people are hot about it. If you throw in God's name, then it becomes divinely sanctioned.
You see, I grew up in a household where we hardly ever we never did. We never spoke politics ever,
Mhm.
ever. So, I mean, my mom made a bigger deal and my dad made a bigger deal if we didn't get up and get going on Sunday morning. Get out of bed,
Right.
How bad are you sick? Are you really, really sick, or are you just putting this on? And that was it. That's what they really stood their ground on. But as far as politics was, I mean, that's what upsets me sometimes when I go over to one of my son's place. That's all they talk about is politics, and that really upsets me because
Mhm.
because
Politics, I mean, in the end, is something that
it's just a game, and the way they cut each other up on those advertisements, it's ridiculous. They're like children.
well, yeah, I mean but that's really another issue.
They should be
But
telling us what they're going to do instead of cutting up the other guy.
mhm.
But the thing is, nobody ever follows through with all the things that they say they're going to do. Nobody does. They may touch on it, but that's it. And then life happens and they do the best they can. Sometimes you just get overwhelmed with your position, right? As a leader.
Right.
I mean, it's not an easy job, that's for sure.
And no,
And I
it's
wouldn't
not.
want to be in their shoes. That's why I like working with preschool kids.
They know right from wrong.
They
Yeah,
do.
My second
They do.
graders would always, yeah, they know that's not fair. That's not right.
Exactly. And they speak up.
They do. They do.
But
So-
anyway, sorry. I didn't mean to.
No. So, I mean, we can't completely, separate ourselves from politics, although, I mean, in some ways, I mean, it depends. I mean, for me, I came from a family that was political.
Mm,
My father was, it's not just my father, my family tradition is very politically focused. They were left-wing Christians. And that was an important part of the family's tradition. And so, it's kind of reflected in me as well.
yeah.
But even so, and apart from that, there's the sort of moral question of, if we're silent, at what point do we become responsible for the evil that's around us?
Right. Yeah.
So in the midst of Christians, opposing mask wearing, and if we look at it, Christians have been very instrumental in promoting, spreading, and continuing the pandemic.
Mm.
And so at this point, virtually everyone who dies from the pandemic, and this has been true really probably since about May, need not have died. So
And
we're
they're
now,
still dying.
right, and they're still dying, and we don't know what the final death toll is going to be. And, it looks like this wave of the pandemic is beginning to subside, but it's still too early, and we don't know if there's going to be another wave. And some,
There were 63 that died in King County today.
Mhm, right,
Holy, that's a lot.
that's a lot,
That's a lot. Oh,
right, that's a lot. And so,
I know that the Black Plague, there were 5 million that died worldwide.
oh, I think it was much more than that.
Was it more than that?
It was something like a quarter of the population. It was totally devastating. And there are still areas of Europe that haven't recovered from the Black Plague,
Mhm.
Black Death. And, that was centuries ago. So, but, there the tendency, in a much simpler time, the tendency was, do you run or do you
You take care of those
take
who
care
are
of people?
ill. Yeah.
And so an important part of the Christian tradition in the plagues is that you stay, you care for people who you don't know. When people die, you
You try to
honor,
protect yourself, but
but
yeah.
you bury the dead, not only your dead, but
Mhm.
you have respect for the lives that are lost.
Mhm.
But the attitude with the anti-mask wearing movement and let's go to church anyway
Ridiculous.
movement, and no mask, vaccine is a hoax or is whatever. This all comes from China, and the whole thing there is that it's an act of selfishness
Mhm.
and acts that historically would be considered unchristian and anti-Christian. And instead of that, much of that comes from the Christian church in various in various sectors of it. And that's just a real that's a real that's a real tragedy.
Mhm.
And similarly, global warming. There should be, no Christian who doesn't believe global warming is a serious problem. You can't possibly believe in the right to life and not believe that global warming is a serious problem. The notion that God is supporting a candidate is a serious problem
Mhm.
because it ultimately means that everything that candidate does, you support. It's very different if you say, candidate X, I believe is the best candidate, or candidate X out of 2 flawed candidates is better than candidate Y. That's an assessment that doesn't tie you to believing in everything that candidate X does. But when it's God's choice, everything candidate does is anointed, X does is anointed.
Mhm.
Right? So in the case of Trump, that means not only did Trump oppose abortion, but he also supported war crimes. So you can't say you oppose war crimes if Trump is God's candidate.
Mhm.
You can't say, I believe in the family because it's God's will that families be separated and children put in cages.
Mhm.
You can't say that.
But that
I
started
believe
a long time ago. That's not just Trump.
it's not just Trump, but it was
It
enormously
was started a long
intensified.
time ago.
It was
Yeah.
enormously intensified under Trump.
Mm.
And
I mean, I feel sorry for the ones that are there right now.
and those families still haven't been reunited in many cases. So the underlying question there, and there again, we have an issue of attaching God's name to it. There's a demonization of all immigrants,
I know, right?
and there's this sort of basic nativism. Only Americans are whatever worthwhile. But also related to that, there's the issue of corruption. One of the hallmarks of Western democracy is that it's been largely free of corruption. Not completely, but very, not at all like, say, Mexican democracy
Oh,
or
right, right.
Indian democracy. I mean,
Right.
the first world democracies have largely been free of corruption. And that's less true in Spain and Italy, but certainly is true in Britain and France and Germany and the United States and Switzerland and Luxembourg. And so,
Mhm.
but corruption, and here again, we have God's will. There, has been an attack on the deep state.
Mm.
What is the deep state? The deep state is a professional bureaucracy. There are people who function in office, regardless of the politics or the president that they serve or leader that they serve,
Mm.
who do their best possible job to bring their expertise to the task at hand. So that professional bureaucracy was centuries in the making, is one of probably the finest accomplishment of Western style democracy, and ensures that the system at some level works. That was attacked in a major way.
Mm.
Many of the entire layers of the professional bureaucracy were removed as part of the attack on the deep state. And under Trump, corruption reached unheard of levels. The only real goal of removing the deep state is simply to be corrupt and to have sort of a Russian style democracy, which is really a kleptocracy where the government is controlled by the rich to fleece the poor in order to enrich the rich. And then, so that's all going on, but that's God's will. And so we see that, in Archbishop Vigano and his attack on the deep state and on the Holy Father.
Mm.
So when we throw God's name in it, it becomes God's will. And when we assign God's will to something besides it being an act of blasphemy,
Mm.
it's also a sin, both personally,
Mm.
That we're accepting as God's will something that's sinful, and two, that we're driving others away from God because we're providing an imitation of Satan to the world and not an imitation of God. So, that's that kind of tendency to attach God's name to everything is, very, very troubling, and especially to attach it to a political candidate, because no political candidate is going to be God's candidate. They're all flawed.
Mhm,
They all have limitations.
mhm.
Nobody is going to do God's will. And our role as, as Catholics is to be informed and to encourage dialogue so that an intelligent choice can be made. It's not to, advertise God's will,
Mhm.
even though
Well, he
he,
does want us to get along. That's God's will. He wants us to be kind to one another,
right,
treat each other equally. That's
Right.
God's will. And
Right.
I wouldn't hesitate saying that.
no, certainly not. So the underlying, if we look at the broader trend in America and in the West, Catholicism is dying, Christianity is dying,
Mhm.
um, and many of the wounds are self-inflicted. We haven't even talked about, the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, and then in Canada there were, the schools for Native Americans, and it's very likely that the same thing happened here, since the Canadian schools were modeled after the American schools, and so that's a potential scandal waiting to happen. And
Mm.
so, but what's striking, throughout church history, the church has always had ebbs and flows. But what's striking is that in each ebb, in each period of decline, there has always been a portion of the church. It's either come from the rank and file priests or from the laity who have changed course, reinvigorated the church in some way. So, we can see an example of it, for example, it's St. John Vianney. So in the aftermath of the French Revolution, the church had fallen into general disdain among all but older French people. Christianity, Catholicism was, considered largely evil. And so, and St. John Vianney was assigned a particularly unbelieving area. There were only, the remnants of the dying old people left. And so what did he do? He acted out love toward neighbor, toward everybody. If you were struggling financially, he tried to provide food. Didn't matter whether you were a believer or not.
Mhm.
And so that was a powerful, expression of the gospel. Elsewhere, in response to the Industrial Revolution, there was a formation of labor unions led by Catholic laity and Catholic priests, and pressure for the 8-hour day, for equitable wages, for better working conditions. That was a really critically important component of Catholic revival. In rural areas, there was the peasant free school movement, an attempt to provide basic literacy, basic mathematical skills, and basic instruction to peasants so that they couldn't be taken advantage of economically. And those, within their context, those things were revitalizing and revolutionary. And so the the important thing, Christianity has its really, we've talked about it over and over again about evangelicalism. It's become about me. And that, individualism has also crept into Catholicism to a degree, not to the same degree, thank God, but certainly to a degree. And as Pope Benedict points out, it's in part caused by the fact that we've emphasized the theology of salvation at the expense of the theology of creation when we need both. But the sense of individualism, that it's about me, that the most pressing issue is whether I go to heaven. And, I've never been a big fan. I've never focused on whether I go to heaven. It's not my concern, but what our concern should be is the state of our neighbor. Our concern should be
It's how much
trying
we
to
loved.
build a world without poverty,
Mhm.
trying to build a world without oppression, trying to build a world in which life in all of its forms is not minimized, or is not degraded, or is not destroyed. Trying to build to support a common home that will continue to support not only future generations of humans, but all of the glory of God's creation and all of the forms of life that God has called into being.
Mhm.
We know that all life, regardless of whether it's human, plant, or animal, is breathed into by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the sole source of life.
Mhm.
So when we move away from that, and when we get that our faith isn't about ourselves, our faith is about ourselves sacrificing ourselves to be a people of God.
Mhm.
Our faith is about focusing on God and not ourselves. And when we move away from that, we begin to commit evil. And it's not merely that we sin a bit, which, even atheists expect that, they don't call it sin, but even atheists recognize that nobody's perfect and everyone does bad stuff. But the problem is, that Christians often go way beyond, take it way over the edge by anyone's standards. And that's really
Sad.
a really horrible thing. Because ultimately Christianity gets blamed, God gets blamed. And then when we drag God's name into it, who else is there to blame?
Mhm.
So in essence, we're causing others to blaspheme the name of the Lord. So we're not only doing it, we're helping others to do it, which means that we're responsible for their sins in many ways more than they are.
Mm.
So that doesn't paint a really pretty picture. So, what that really emphasizes is, one, that we personally, are aware of the problem of Christianity and evil, and to the best of our ability and knowledge, we refrain from participating. I think it also means, that we try to, within our church community, within the archdiocese, to the extent that we can, within broader church as a whole, oppose evil and support good. So say, for example, I've been really impressed with our Laudato Si blog. I think that, that's made, probably nobody reads it, but But
We
the point
tried.
is that
We
it's
tried.
there
Yeah.
and we haven't been silent. So that's, doing something. St. Vincent de Paul does,
Oh, they're
the
wonderful.
parish does enormously valuable work in helping the poor, whether they're Catholic or not, and most aren't.
Mhm.
So, that's really, really, really important. So, where we can, both individually and collectively and as a body of Christ, we have to ensure that we make a difference.
We're also joining up with our St. Vincent de Paul team with prepares at over at Holy Family, and prepares works with, I think they're mostly single moms that are trying to provide for their families,
Yeah,
and I think that's just a wonderful outreach.
yeah,
And St. Vincent de Paul is going to help us with that. So
yeah.
we're going to try to collect, things for them.
That is a wonderful outreach. Yeah.
So I think the more we do that type of thing, that's, I think as long as we can keep focusing on how we can help and
Mhm.
do things,
Right.
even for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, and hopefully throughout the rest of the year.
Right. And then the other thing which I really struggle with is, when do you say something? So I mean, I kind of in looking at the prophets, they delivered what they felt was the word of the Lord, which no one wanted to hear,
Yeah.
which wasn't very uh, which wasn't very nice.
Well, and homilies used to be sometimes pretty eye-opening. And sometimes all you get is the soft stuff,
Right. Yeah. Do you remember? I don't know. It was maybe 2 years ago. Maybe it was before the pandemic.
Father
We had
Ramon?
what?
Oh, was it
No,
Father
this was
Ramon?
this. No, it was Father Boo was gone
Okay,
for the weekend, and it was an African priest.
okay.
Um, and so I don't remember exactly the details of his homily, but he ended it by asking the question, "And what are you going to do to crucify Christ again?"
Ooh,
Mhm.
I don't remember that one.
It was a powerful homily.
Oh,
And,
well, I always get very uncomfortable when we have to read that during Easter, when we have to say, crucify him, crucify him. We want Barabbas. And I'm thinking, I don't want Barabbas. I want Jesus.
but that's
That makes me so uncomfortable.
yeah. There was a painting, I think by Repin. There's a movement in Russian art. It was called the Peredvishniki, the itinerants. They were realist painters.
Yeah.
So I think it was by Repin, although it may not. He was the leader of the school, but it was called something like Christ Comes Again. And so Christ was coming down, from a mountain, and the response of the poor was joyful, but the response of the non-poor was, he hadn't even arrived yet, and they were growling and sneering and snarling and making faces, and
Ooh.
it was a really, a really powerful painting. It was one of my favorites, and I think it was Repin. So,
Have
but
you've seen it?
yeah,
Where was it?
it was in
Was it in the Louvre or the Vatican
in
Museum?
the Russian museum in
Oh,
Moscow.
it was the Russian Museum. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's kind of a question. What would we do if Christ comes again?
And what would he look like? Yeah. Well,
Um,
that's like even while Christ was on this earth, they thought he was going to come as a military leader
mhm,
on a horse or whatever with a sword in his hand,
right,
right?
right.
So no, he comes, he's very humble and
But, although every Christian is supposed to profess an anticipation of his coming,
right.
most probably would prefer that it not happen.
Well, not right now. Let us give us a minute.
And especially,
Confession first, quick.
and especially there's this view that it's, catastrophic, the end of the world, everything goes up in
Yeah.
flames.
Well,
And
that's because of Revelation and what John wrote.
it's because of the misinterpretation of Revelation. John himself is not to be blamed. I
No,
mean,
I know.
Revelation is.
I wasn't here when you did Revelation. I wish I was.
Revelation is inspirational. It's not a work of horror.
Yeah.
Which is another thing. Many Christians have turned God into, a work of horror. A reflection of that was, remember when we had I hijacked our Matthew Bible study to address the issue of whether God caused the pandemic.
Mm.
God is always,
Mhm.
Christians always like to see God as inflicting suffering on others
Mhm.
for their sins,
Right.
which, I find totally outrageous, because the sins of others are usually minor in comparison, and many often they're illusory. One of the big things, and we departed from being a godly nation because we removed God from prayers in school.
I wish they did, though. I wish they did still have that.
Well, they still do. It's just it can't be compulsory. You can't force
But
prayer.
we did, yeah, we had it in the public schools.
Right, but it was
Yeah.
compulsory. But
Yeah,
that's not. So, the meaning of prayer is that it's intended to be a form of communication with God.
right.
When you force people to pray, it's not communication
No,
with God.
that's true.
It's
Yeah.
forced prayer. As an atheist, I would absolutely object to prayer in school. And, I think it's inappropriate to force atheists and agnostics and the unchurched to pray. But also, as a Catholic, typically, you don't say anymore a known prayer, right? So it's unlikely to begin with Our Father, and even if you begin with Our Father, there's, but so the issue kind of is, as a Catholic, do you really want prayer in public school? Because prayer is going to be largely, evangelical inspired at this point. And even if you pray Our Father, which version of Our Father do you use?
I use the one
And-
that we have in the church.
And what does, and so
The
if
one
you
that's in
use,
our Bible.
that's the one not likely to be used. You're likely to use the Protestant version. And
Yeah.
if you use the Protestant version, then does that endorse Protestantism over Catholicism? I would argue that it does,
Mm.
because there's this, deeply held view that we have a tainted Bible. I think prayer in public school,
Mm.
unless it's done on a voluntary basis, is just totally inappropriate and not in keeping with the message of the gospel or with Jesus' teaching. But in any case, the point of all of this is, that prayer was removed from school. Now we're under God's judgment. X happened. Now the nation is under God's judgment. X happened, and everybody else is going to be, and I'm protected by the blood of Jesus. And, that's ridiculous. It's kind of like God is our personal henchman.
In some ways, the people who aren't practicing in my family, Catholics, seem to be the most, I'm not, no, I can't say that I'm excluded from that, but so many people who aren't practicing Catholics or Christians behave more Christian than a lot of people who claim to be.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
And that's the hardest part to look at is, this administration now is trying to feed the hungry and shelter the homeless and provide care for families, for people with children, giving a better life
Mhm.
to children. And he's being panned on all these other levels and trying to take care of the refugees. And I know that's been backfired in the last couple of days, but with turning away people.
Hmm.
But
Mm.
yeah, but some of the people I know or listen to have more Christian ideals of what we should be doing as a society.
right.
And
Yeah,
it's not spreading the untruth. It's not condemning other people or bearing false witness.
mhm,
It's trying to do what's good for others, and then they're being called socialists.
right. Yeah,
And things
anyone
can
who
be
isn't,
funded by, raising the
anyone
tax
who
burden.
isn't a fascist is a communist or a socialist.
Yeah, yeah,
The interesting thing, nobody seems to know what a communist or a socialist actually is.
yeah.
The notion that, say, Nancy Pelosi is a communist or a socialist is ridiculous.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And, well, I mean, but and that's a major tragedy of our time, that in many ways non-Christians are more Christian than Christians.
Hmm.
And that's sad. I mean, that's, a major disincentive to become a Christian.
mhm.
So that's very, very sad.
But that's like the difference between different churches too. I mean, I feel that our church is really involved with a lot of different things.
Or, yeah.
And then there's other churches like the one that we used to go to in Toronto. And yeah, they have a few things going on, but Other than that, you don't hear very much about other things
right?
that are
Yeah,
needed
I mean,
for other
it's a,
people.
it's a function of individual church.
Yeah,
It's a function of denomination. And,
even within the same denomination, some
Right.
churches aren't outreaching
right,
like they should.
right. And then, you know, in terms of, I mean, what has really become predominant in America is evangelical fundamentalism. And, you know, evangelical fundamentalism, and we've discussed, as we've looked at the areas of apologetics, all of the discontinuities, the significance of dispensationalism, the way in which um, it um, evangelical fundamentalism cuts itself off from not only the church's traditions, but the Jewish tradition that underlies our faith. Way in which it's cut itself off from the teachings of the fathers and substituted something entirely new. So it is really the predominant form of Christianity in America today. And, especially the thing that everyone looks at when they think of Christianity. And particularly it's the white evangelical church that people look at. It's not, even, the general view, among the unchurched of the Black evangelical church is largely favorable, like Martin Luther King is a revered person, the major civil rights leaders who are still living, have a great deal, command a great deal of respect, but the white evangelical church, which is numerically predominant, at least in white America and in white Christianity, is
Hmm.
you know um,
Well, Carmen, it's like what you were talking
lost.
about earlier, that, about politics and politicians always just slamming somebody else. And that's what's happening now
Yeah,
with these evangelical movements. Is like,
yeah,
you worship Mary, you
yeah.
have to
Yeah,
go to
all
a
you do
priest. I
is
mean, all these things
criticize
that are
everybody else. Yeah,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly. Instead of speaking the truth or living the truth
yeah.
to try to, yeah.
You just
Yeah, I
throw
was
darts at the other person.
exactly
Yeah.
trying to think of, okay, what would this class have been like? But you have to go back several years, even before the pandemic, but go back to 2000 and, before 2016. Well, even before that. Because while Obama was president, Trump was trying to say he's not really an American. All these unbeliefs and all these untruths that kept being perpetuated. And he's not the only one, but all these things, these unbeliefs and disbeliefs that keep being spread but aren't stopped.
Mm,
Yeah,
mm,
That's the worst of it. That's what's gotten worse.
the
Is
the
that-
level of discord,
Yes.
or the level of non-communication went up in a major way when Obama became president,
Yeah.
I think. And I mean, it wasn't only Trump doing it. It was,
Right.
I mean, I think the basic thing is that for many in white America, particularly, the fact that there was a Black president was a total outrage.
mm.
And so,
Yet he was elected twice.
right, he was elected twice.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, I mean, Trump's rhetoric has been just explicitly divisive. He's
Mhm.
demeaned and
Mhm.
diminished people wherever
Mhm.
possible. And that's been, I mean, he's used fear wherever possible. All of his opponents are communists and socialists, which, you know, is just ridiculous. I mean, and but his rhetoric has really, you know, picked up, and the incidence of hate crimes in America has really, you know, sort of closely correlated to his rhetoric.
Mm.
And hate crimes are just,
They're out of
Yeah.
control now.
they're out of control now.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, they become acceptable.
Yep.
Well, they're not
And-
acceptable. Well, yeah.
Because nobody stands up to him, and
And-
says, no, this is wrong.
Hate crimes are acceptable, guns are acceptable.
Guns
in
were
a-
always acceptable. I
Racism
mean,
is-
as a Canadian, I remember we used to just, it just used to boggle our mind that people, so many guns in the States would be used to kill people.
But it's gotten worse,
It has.
gotten
Yeah.
much worse. And, you know,
Yeah.
proliferation,
Now it's just
the
random.
proliferation of guns
shoot
has
at a
gotten
car
much
that's
worse.
going by, or you
And
throw rocks at it.
yeah, and there again, you know,
It's
Christians
ridiculous.
are often, you know, staunch supporters of our so-called Second Amendment rights. I mean, I think I told you about the funeral I went to where, you know, the major theme was that the person who died loved guns. And, you
Yeah.
know, it's kind of like it's a funeral or a memorial service. At my memorial service, I would like it to be said that I am a person who loved God.
Opposed guns, right?
Pro
Or-
Not
gun.
even oppose guns, a person who loved God.
There you go.
I
Yeah.
don't,
Yeah. Of
don't
course.
love guns.
No.
I
So you don't
mean,
even have to have a permit to walk around with a gun in Texas, I guess.
yeah, I mean,
Yet they're
It's-
making, all this other stuff for voting, right?
it's ridiculous.
It's just,
People
This-
walking around with guns are intimidating. I mean, people walking around with guns pose a public danger, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah.
Underlying it, you know, is a problem of an enormous growth in poverty, a curtailing of social services to deal with poverty, a growth in, you know, mental illness,
Well, even with the housing market, I mean, it's ridiculous how high it's going.
right? Housing, yeah, I mean, homelessness is a
People are
severe
losing their
problem.
houses,
Yeah,
right? Because they can't
right.
keep up.
Right. The you know, you know, if we look at, you know, the statistics on income distribution and control of wealth, the a shockingly small proportion of people own the overwhelming majority of wealth in this country.
yeah.
And, you know, that the proportion that they own is growing constantly. So the wealthy are constantly becoming wealthier.
And they're not paying
And-
taxes.
Well, and
Yeah.
that's what I was
Rid of
gonna
our debt.
say. They should be
Yeah.
paying a lot of tax
They
then.
should be
That would
paying
cover a lot
and-
of these
and-
things that we're trying to pass in
and-
legislature.
And corporations should be paying a lot
Yeah.
of tax.
Oh, sure, they should.
And- But, you know, our current fiscal crisis is caused in large part by the fact that the tax rates were cut dramatically for corporations
Yeah.
under, you know, well, I mean, there's no point in getting into it.
Right.
I don't want to get into politics.
But, so, you know, we have problems of homelessness, we have problems of housing, we have problems of of employment. We have problems of growing poverty.
Yeah.
We have all of these social problems, and we have, a basic curtailment of the funds needed to treat them. So one of the issues with defunding the police is that money that should have been put into had been put into mental health is now being put into the police, and police are forced to be crisis intervention people,
Yeah, that's because
counselors.
there's too many guns out there.
That's a whole separate issue.
Oh, okay.
Um, it- I mean, the problem is that as a society, we're increasingly breaking down, so that what things that used to bind us, kind of a common sense of human decency
Mhm,
has broken down.
mhm.
And, the embracing of guns, is something you do when your fundamental principle of life is look out for number one.
Mm.
And then, well, we won't get into that either. And so, but as a society, we've really broken down in a fundamental way.
Mhm.
And the kind of really bizarre thing is that there's a portion of the American population that particularly embraces things that are not in their best interest, that embrace the means of their own destruction, so that the rich can continue to get richer and can continue to plunder everybody. And fundamentally, that's what the Trump movement is all about. I mean, the goal of Trump was to enrich the rich,
Mhm.
and particularly himself. I mean, he, is a person with absolutely no integrity who, is simply a grifter.
Yeah.
And his goal has been to ensure that his grift is successful. And, so, and unfortunately, large numbers of Christians go along with that. So related to that, is one of the statements that makes is that integrity doesn't matter.
Right.
Telling the truth is optional. Truth is transactional. Depends on what you'll get out of it. And, so a good lesson, a good thing to watch is the Jim Baker show, which, I try not to, but do you know who he is?
Jim and Tammy Baker.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he's the televangelist who went to jail for fraud. So, he's a grifter, a scumbag, a dirtbag, a liar. And
And people love him.
I think those are the most favorable things I can think of saying about him. But the point is that he's back and people love him. And, he's a liar and a dirtbag.
Wow.
It's, well, we're way out of, actually, we're half
We
an
need our
hour.
Decalogue back.
Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
We need
yeah. Even though the Decalogue is only, kind of a bare minimum, but
Well,
nevertheless,
yeah,
It's a
we've gone so far beyond the bare minimum. I mean, you know, even the bare minimum is such a great improvement. Like, you know, telling the truth.
yeah, no kidding.
That's taking responsibility for something that's, you know. But we're out of time.